This is the concierge, sir.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Concierge Confidential. I'm your host, Brian Ortega, and in this episode today, this is the second episode of the week. I'm going to try to do more two-episode weeks, I guess. It's going to be hard to just give recommendations every single time I come on here, so I thought I would actually dive into a topic that people find pretty interesting about the city of Las Vegas, and that is, especially with all of the quote-unquote price gouging of the Strip, and was it really better back in the good old days? So I thought I'd talk about the relationship of the mob and Las Vegas. It really goes kind of hand in hand for telling the history of how Las Vegas came to be, and really the romanticism of the city of Las Vegas. And I thought I'd give you kind of like a brief history of that in 30 minutes or less, of how Las Vegas became known as sort of like that sort of like cool place that mobsters ran, and then you can rub elbows with them and movie stars at the same time, and really how they shaped the city of Las Vegas, but not entirely the entire city of Las Vegas. There's really a lot of things that have been sort of twisted into sort of that's the facts, but just kind of using my history as a tour guide, I'm going to try to kind of weave you through the history of Las Vegas in, again, 30 minutes or less, and try to do it in kind of a fun, interesting way, kind of like if you were on my tour in Las Vegas back in the day. So this is the When Mob Ran Las Vegas episode of Concierge Confidential. Okay, guys, let's go ahead and dive into it. So the city of Las Vegas itself is a little over 100 years old. So it's actually kind of a young city when you look at the grand scheme of, the United States. Incorporated about 1905. And honestly, the first people to come here were Mormon farmers who were trying to, break ground in the city of Las Vegas as they moved away from Utah, and found out that you can't really farm a lot of things in Las Vegas, and really had kind of a sleepy history from like the early 1900s up until about the 1930s. So what was this big thing that happened in the 30s? So the major thing was the Great Depression, and then that brought along the Hoover Dam. So the Hoover Dam was built starting on, it was in 1931 or 1930, give or take a year or two, when Herbert Hoover signed the appropriations bill that tried to get, Americans back to work and sort of try to figure out how to, build these certain things. And that's where he built Boulder Dam. And this is a really important jumping off point because the Hoover Dam, which was actually built ahead of schedule, 2 years, in fact, and I actually used to think, and this was sort of like my ridiculous thing, I believed that the Hoover Dam itself was actually some part of the New Deal, which it was not. I just thought it was back in the good old days. So that's my bad. But it was built, and what happened was that, well, it's such a fun story, that if you go to Boulder City, it is actually illegal to gamble in the city, or back in the day, drink in the city limits of Boulder City, because it was actually a government city, a city built or appropriated by the U.S. government for the workers, because they actually did not want them going to Las Vegas, where it was the total opposite, where a lot of sin and vice was encouraged and okay. They didn't want you to do that. So they actually ended up making you, if you were a worker, stay in Boulder City. But believe me, there was a train that went from Boulder City to downtown Las Vegas. Same thing if you're coming from Los Angeles. It was a very popular stop, especially if you watch the movie The Godfather, for GIs going from the east into California, or from Utah to California, where a lot of the naval bases were, or Marine and Army bases, honestly, and then Navy bases. You would stop at Fremont Street because that's where the Main Street station is. So that's why we have the Main Street Casino still on Fremont Street today, where they still have the the old school train car that you used to be able to dine in. Not anymore, unfortunately, but beautiful casino on the inside. But with that, in 1931, because we had such economic downturn because of the Great Depression, they felt that it would be a really good way to collect tax credits or taxes on businesses by having legalized gambling, which we had illegal gambling for a good amount of time before it was legalized in 1931. And the first person to actually get a gaming license was a woman. I always forget her name, which I always feel terrible about. So sorry. A lot of this stuff actually, guys, is actually coming off the top of my head because I wanted to give you sort of a conversational sort of idea of the city of Las Vegas and the history really quick. So this happened in 1931, and essentially that is what the jumping off point was for casinos being big business here in the city of Las Vegas. So when does the mob and mafia come into play? So really this actually does happen about the 40s, about 1941 into 1945, which will be important coming up in just a second. So really what this meant was, or how did the mob get to Las Vegas? They found they weren't going to be able to break into the local government in terms of owning a casino, building a casino, and running a casino. So how are they able to get in? So the thing was that back in the good old days, you used to have these telephone wires that have to go crisscrossing the country. And it's a very old system, but it was a very lucrative system, especially if you were the one who owned the wires that went from the East Coast to the West Coast. And most of the time, a lot of the sports and such came from different places, mostly the East Coast. And what happened was that a couple of people, including somebody you may know, his name is Bugsy Siegel, or Benjamin Siegel, his family or his group actually owned one of the wires that went from the East Coast to Las Vegas. So these wires actually carried the results for horse races, big prize fights. Any result that you might need in terms of sports would go through this wire, and you would use this wire service. So these wire services were essentially like sports books inside of hotels, and they were third-party systems. So what would happen was that a casino would hire your specialized business to have this wire system in the casino, and you would create or you would actually get a very large percentage of what came into that casino for them using these wires. So with that being said, that was a way for them to get a foothold into the casino business by being sort of this third party gaining into a casino, which is kind of funny because that's really what a lot of new casinos do, especially in new jurisdictions, not Las Vegas, but places like Missouri, places like Arkansas, places like Kentucky that actually have casinos already, but didn't have a sportsbook operation didn't have a sportsbook operation for the longest time. So instead of actually creating their own and having to figure out the technology, they actually hire third-party companies like DraftKings, FanDuel, Circa, and put them inside of an existing brick-and-mortar casino already. So all they have to do is license the technology. They're the ones that actually get this amenity that's coming into the casino, and people come and watch these games and such. And I'm sure that they have a system worked out of how they make the split and what the licensing deal is in that case. So that's basically what's happening now, but much more legal, which was sort of legal back in the day, but a little bit more gray area back then. And the thing about being back in the 40s is that there weren't that many casinos and there weren't that many businesses that ran these operations. So really, you might have had 2 wire services in the entire city of Las Vegas servicing multiple hotels. So one of the first major hotels built was the Northern Club, which is actually where the first gaming license was. The Northern Club was owned by Miriam Stocker, which is the first person to have a gaming license in the city of Las Vegas in the history of Nevada. Isn't that awesome that we always think that casinos and hotels are very male focused, but the first person to actually own a gaming license is a woman? It's really fantastic. But the fun little story behind this was that it is rumored that Miriam Stocker, her husband and her son worked for the railroad or worked for Hoover Dam, one of the two, and it was illegal for them to actually have a gaming license because they worked for the railroad or for the Boulder City or Boulder Dam. So for them to be able to run a casino, they had their wife, mom, actually sign for the gaming license, and they were the ones that ran it. So really fantastic. And it was really, really kind of a fun little nugget, which you can no longer see the Northern Club. That's where the Le Bayou used to be, which is now part of the Golden Gate expansion. So sorry, guys, you guys can't go back and see the good old Le Bayou or Northern Club, unfortunately. So as we're kind of just moving through history here, so one of the first major hotels built on the Las Vegas Strip was the El Rancho. The El Rancho was a legit place. It was opened in 1942, and this was really the first hotel on the Las Vegas Strip. Up until this point, a lot of the hotels were really focused on Fremont Street, which really no mob business no mob family had really gained a hold of a casino outright. A lot of them were still owned by old school local casino owners or business owners, and really you would just license the wire service, and that was really the only way that the mob or mafia was in the system at that point. But as we fast forward into the mid 1940s, this is sort of like in the middle of World War II, which is a really important time, especially for the mob moving into Las Vegas, because you had a lot of this sort of industry that was available. And just to rewind really quick, because this becomes very important, is the reason that the mob was so attuned to a city like Las Vegas is because they were doing a lot of the things that have become known for Sin City already back in places like New York and Chicago, whether it be during Prohibition when they were actually running alcohol up from the South or even from Canada. So they had a feel for like speakeasies, and not the speakeasies as you know now, but trafficking, alcohol and that kind of thing. Also illegal gambling, which they would have in gambling halls as well. Another thing that really isn't legal in Nevada, well, at least in Las Vegas, is brothels. This was a service that you were able to get in these places. They had experience with that as well too. So a lot of the things that you think of when you think of the mob are things that you think of Las Vegas. So it was natural for them to make the natural transition to owning casinos, which is, a vice that most people know about. So anyways, fast forwarding to 1946, we have started the construction on the Flamingo. This would have taken place in the 1945. And this was actually the brainchild of Billy Wilkerson. Billy Wilkerson is actually the person who came up with the idea for the Flamingo. This is our first sort of myth about Las Vegas, is that many people believe that Benjamin Bugsy Siegel was the one who came up with the idea and the whole sort of concept of a city in Las Vegas, a casino in Las Vegas, a glamorous place. And the thing is it really wasn't his idea at all. He came in sort of like midway through when Billy Wilkerson was actually had a lot of debt on the actual hotel itself or the construction, and ended up partnering up with Bugsy Siegel, and then ended up having to give over the entire property to Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, and secretly Meyer Lansky, who was helping sort of figure out or fund this enterprise. But a little story about Billy Wilkerson. Billy Wilkerson actually owned the Hollywood Reporter back in the good old days. And the thing is that we want to figure out, like, why do hotels have palm trees, or why do we have palm trees in the middle of the Strip? So, couple things. This is one of those things where we've actually just come up with stories about it, and they all kind of sound nice. So I'm going to explain sort of my take on this. And it's slightly true. So you own the Hollywood Reporter in Los Angeles, of course, which is known for their Sunset Strip and the street known as Sunset. And by the mid-1940s, they would actually, the city of Los Angeles would have been quite developed thanks to the movie industry. Sunset Boulevard is a real place. It was actually, quite prosperous at that point, and they had all these palm trees. So they actually shipped palm trees, not natural to the city of Las Vegas, and put them in front of the Flamingo, and they are now on the middle of the Las Vegas Strip. And that was because Billy Wilkerson wanted Vegas to be like Los Angeles, So instead of calling it the Sunset Strip, we now call it just the Las Vegas Strip on Las Vegas Boulevard on your way to Los Angeles or Utah. And that's where we came up with the palm trees. That's my story. I'm sticking to it. But the thing about Billy Wilkerson is that other than being a really wealthy gentleman, he was also a very bad gambler. He loved to gamble. No connection to the mob. Obviously, he knew people in the mob, but that's kind of like what you did back in those days. But Billy Wilkerson himself was a very, very bad gambler. And that's essentially why he ended up losing the property to Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. But one of the great innovations that this was sort of Billy Wilkerson's idea was that he loved to play blackjack. And in blackjack, if you go now to any place in Las Vegas or in the world, you will find padding right before you get to the actual felt of the game. And this was actually his idea because back in the day, they did not have these pads. So you had no place to put your elbows. And what do people who like to gamble a lot do? They like to put their elbows on the tables. And with that being said, he thought it'd be a great idea to put pads on the tables so he'd be able to put his elbows on and be much more relaxed. Because if you're going to be sitting there for hours, that's what you would want. But that's a little brief history of Billy Wilkerson and the Flamingo. But with that being said, moving on with Bugsy Siegel's investment, the hotel ended up opening in December 26, 1946, which ended up being one of the worst openings of a hotel in a very long time. So the thing was that Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, very good-looking gentleman. Look at any pictures of him. People say he was a wonderfully beautiful man, but not the nicest. He was also part of this little thing called Murder, Inc. back in the day. That was a group of Jewish mobsters that worked as basically hitmen for the Italian mob back in New York before they, made their way out to different outposts in the United States of America. But with that being said, he came to Las Vegas, obviously hooked up with Billy Wilkerson at this point, ended up, taking over the hotel, and he said, you know what? A great time would be to open up the hotel right after Christmas. Everyone's going to be here. Why wouldn't they be here? The thing was that he did not know that it would get extremely cold during that time of the year, and also nobody travels during that time of the year. And another thing that sort of didn't help was that this was back in the days when we had the studio system in Los Angeles and Hollywood. So many of the big stars for these studios were friends with people like this. Were friends and loved to gamble. And this is sort of like during, we call the Hays Code era, which this goes into Hollywood, where they were trying to get away from vices. This is very different from the silent film era, where they wanted everybody to be very virtuous and be very, very well-mannered and not, indulge in their vices. Well, Vegas is not known for that. So a lot of the studio heads, this is sort of became what the fight was that they told a lot of their stars that if they ended up going to the opening of that hotel in Las Vegas, i.e. the Flamingo, that they would not be put in movies and they would be dropped from their contracts and never work in the town again. Well, that sucks. So with that being said, nobody ended up going to the opening in Las Vegas, which then had a cascading effect because then they said, well, you know who owns the all the extras in town? And that would be the Teamsters Union. The Teamsters, which are also the truck drivers, were very much controlled by, if not adjunct, controlled by the mafia across the nation. Which then brings me to a very important point about how did we fund these hotels going forward. A lot of hotels, especially built in the 1940s into the mid-50s, were owned by lawyers as frontmen or just business owners or things of these guys of this nature. A lot of lawyers. That was sort of like the big thing. But what ended up happening was that they would need funding. So they would end up getting loans from banks, obviously. But a major player in this, or major place that would get funding, would be from the Teamsters Pension Fund, which if you've ever seen the movie Casino, there is some truth to being connected to the Teamsters Union, is that they would use their pension money and then they would actually end up investing in a casino in Las Vegas, which was then controlled by a frontman, and then you would also have usually a family or a group or a crew that would run that casino, the casino operations portion of it. So I don't want to get too bogged down in a lot of like who owned what, but many hotels back in the day were at least somewhat controlled by the mob or mafia. You're going to find out the ones that weren't owned by the mob or mafia ended up having very, very long, flourishing careers. So we'll go over a couple of hotels that were known for some mob activity. One of the more famous ones would be the Dunes Hotel. The Dunes was really well known for being a mafia joint. It also wasn't a very successful property. It did last until about the mid 1990s before it was blown up for the Bellagio. But it was a place that actually did end up having a golf course. It ended up having, well, it turned into a country club. And then it also had a spa, of course, and then all the other good stuff. And even at the grand opening of the Dunes Hotel, they actually were able to have Frank Sinatra. I believe this was in like sort of the late 50s, early mid 60s. Frank Sinatra rode in on an actual elephant into the dunes, which a lot of the times you would find a lot of the hotels that were built in like the 40s and 50s always had very unique themes, which I think we've gotten away from, which we should get back to, but always had sort of like desert themes to go with sort of like the desert backdrop. Like you had the sands that opened in the 50s. You also had the dunes that opened in the 50s as well. The Riviera was opened and it was supposed to sort of look like South Beach, which was all white, and which was very common for South Beach back in the the mid turn of the century. Then you had the Riviera that opened in the late 50s. I want to say the early 60s. I'd have to go back and double check in my brain. And of course, you'd have the Desert Inn that opened back in the day as well. The Desert Inn opened in the early 60s. I want to say late 50s, early 60s for the Dunes, which the Dunes and the Sands, very, very iconic hotels. There was a gentleman, I believe his name is, oh my goodness, I'm going to forget off the top of my head. You'd have to let me get back to you guys on that one. But anyways, getting back into sort of like why they're known as sort of why the mob and the city of Las Vegas is sort of connected, is because they really were. They were really the financiers of a lot of these major properties, and also how they made these places run as a business. And really, it helped knowing that the mafia or the mob was running a lot of the things in town for security reasons. Just because they were the ones who made sure that things didn't get out of hand when you get into a casino, and they were also the people that had the connections to celebrities to visit Las Vegas. And this is where we'll get into the golden era of Vegas in the mid-1950s, where we had the Rat Pack come into town. There is a scene in The Godfather where it sort of alludes to this, is that I believe Mo Green, who's the character in Godfather, he actually runs the hotel. But Michael Corleone, playing one of the big mafia members, gets the adjunct Frank Sinatra character to come to Las Vegas and bring all of his friends. This is obviously going off of the history that Frank Sinatra would play in Las Vegas. He would come with all of his friends. It helped that Frank Sinatra liked to gamble, so that was very helpful. But he would come to Las Vegas along with, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Joey Bishop, Peter Lawford. That's the original Rat Pack that would come to Las Vegas. But in the end, we would mostly know the Rat Pack as the three main guys, which was Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, and Sammy Davis Jr. So they would end up coming to Las Vegas and performing at the Sands in the Copa Room at the Sands. And it was always funny because you would actually go to the Sands and it would say, now performing in the Copa Room, Frank Sinatra and maybe Dean Martin, or Sammy Davis, or Peter Lawford, because they never really knew who was going to be there. And it was really more of a hangout thing, and it was really this sort of like transporting of La Copacabana in in New York, and then the Coconut Grove, which was at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, and putting it here in Las Vegas. And it was really a place that you would hang out, you would have dinner, but then you'd have this show in front of you where it was just these guys hanging out in front, talking, doing jokes. They never actually really did a show. It was really just you're hanging out sort of like in a living room, a really large living room with the people like Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin. And this is very important because this became sort of the stalwart of what people think of Las Vegas as. It's a place that you come for entertainment, and then in turn you are going to gamble in the casino and you're going to stay in the hotels. And of course have these beautiful pools as well. So that was the idea. back in those days. You really didn't make money off of the show. They actually were very strict, and they really wanted that show to be like a tight 90 minutes. It's like, yes, we'll give you 90 minutes for free. Well, you paid for it, but we'll give you 90 minutes. But the rest of that weekend belongs to the casino, and that was sort of the idea behind the casino back in those days. And again, if you go back and watch the movie Casino with Robert De Niro and Joe Pesci, Sharon Stone, that depicts a much later era of Las Vegas. But it does show how the mob and mafia sort of infiltrated these casinos by being sort of the back door or the dark shroud that would come in and they would skim the casino, and that's the way they would make money off of the casino, and they wouldn't have to report it, obviously. The thing was that back in those days is that we did have a black book and that kind of thing, and then we did have a gaming commission, but really was much more lax back in those days just because it was sort of like one hand washes the other, a lot of corruption, obviously, but essentially, when it came to sort of the everyday person, you didn't run into a lot of these issues because as long as you didn't steal, they didn't, mess with you. Hence, card counters. Card counters looked the same as cheaters back in those days, but it all changed, obviously. So how did the mob ended up moving out and getting out of Las Vegas? Really, a lot of this had to do with the incoming corporate money by people like Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes is a really important figure in terms of changing what Las Vegas was back in those days. It was known as sort of the Wild Wild West. It was very, high end in terms of tourism and casinos of that age, but it did have this sort of patina on it that it was run by the mob, and they're really trying to get out of this, especially in the late 50s with the Keyhofer Committee hearings, which a lot of the mafia people were named in that. But with the adjunct of Howard Hughes came into Las Vegas in about the mid 60s, sort of during like the golden era of Las Vegas. And he started purchasing hotels. And really one of the more fun stories about Howard Hughes, which I think Howard Hughes is actually a fascinating character, which I'd love to talk more about, maybe in depth of how he went about collecting these casinos. But he came to Las Vegas, moved into the Desert Inn, which the Desert Inn was it's where the Wynn now sits, and he lived on top of the Desert Inn for 2 or 3 years, and was at that point wasn't asked to leave for a very long time, and essentially he would stay up there. And then he never wanted to leave. They actually went up to his executive, I believe Mayhew, and they asked him, "Sir, we need Howard Hughes to leave. Like he's been here long enough, and we're getting complaints, and we need him to leave the hotel." And what happened was that Howard Hughes, one of the richest men in the world, heard about this and then asked, "How much is the hotel?" And they said, "Well, it's this much amount of money." And he said, "Okay, let's use a figure here. So, let's see. So, I was just reading the part of the story here. So essentially, he said, "How much for the entire hotel?" And they said, "Well, it's going to cost you $100 million." And he said, "Okay," and then bought the hotel. He, I believe, told his executive said, "Then buy it. I'll buy the damn thing." And he bought the Desert Inn because he didn't want to leave. And if that isn't a fun story about I can do whatever I want and just whatever. Essentially, this is if Jeff Bezos lived in the Desert Inn or lived inside the Wynn Hotel, and they said, "You have to leave, sir." He says, "How much for this hotel?" And he said, "I'll buy it." That's how it goes. Obviously, you can't do that now because of what Howard Hughes did. He actually created a lot of the rules of owning a hotel in Las Vegas where he couldn't actually have done that particular option. But back in the day, a lot of things were privately owned. So it wasn't a big deal. So with that, Howard Hughes, a compulsive man that he is, ended up wanting to buy a lot of the property on the Strip. He would actually end up going and end up buying more than like 5 or 6 properties on the Las Vegas Strip until the Justice Department jumped in and actually stopped him from buying properties due to the antitrust laws in the United States, and he was not allowed to purchase any more properties. Another really fun story about Howard Hughes, this has had to take place while he was staying at the Desert Inn, is across the street from the Desert Inn was the Silver Slipper, and the Silver Slipper is a big giant white slipper that rotates, and it's white, and he could not sleep at night, and they kept asking him, like, and then he said, "What is that big bright light?" And he says, "That's the Silver Slipper." And he says, I want you guys to turn that light off. And they said, "We are not going to turn the light off at this time." And he ended up saying, "Well, I'm going to buy that hotel." And he bought the hotel just so he can turn the light off of the Silver Slipper. So yeah, this was a guy. One more Howard Hughes story for you guys because it's one of my favorites. So Howard Hughes, brief history. Howard Hughes was Howard Hughes was friends with Ava Gardner back in the good old days. Ava Gardner, a femme fatale, beautiful actress, really well known in classic Hollywood, and she was famously married to Mr. Frank Sinatra. So they had a very tumultuous relationship. I think they really liked each other, but obviously did not work out. And this ended up meaning that Howard Hughes was not really a fan of Frank Sinatra. He did not like that he was very expensive to have inside of his casinos, which he owned the Sands at this point. And he actually did not like a lot of the money that he was spending inside of the casinos. He was very expensive. So he actually limited him. He said, let's just say that Frank Sinatra would usually take out, let's just say, $50,000 a night to gamble. I'm using sort of a general number. And they said, well, he can only have $10,000 tonight. And this was not liked by Mr. Frank Sinatra. So this actually happened, is that Frank Sinatra got into a golf cart at the Desert Inn. The Desert Inn had a golf course, and there was this big cafe that actually had glass windows that looked out to the country club. And when he got in the golf cart, he saw that Robert Mayhew, the second in command for Howard Hughes, was actually eating lunch at that cafe. He ended up getting in the golf cart and driving through a plate glass window to get into a fight with the second in command for Howard Hughes, and then he did the show that night with a bloody lip and said, "I'll never perform at this property again," and never performed at the Sands ever again, and moved over to Caesar's Palace, where he performed essentially until about the mid-90s. So Frank Sinatra, Howard Hughes, a very important person in the city of Las Vegas. There's a place called Summerlin, which is actually out in the suburbs. Summerlin is actually named after, and I thank my friend Ryan Hunter for letting me know this, it's actually named after Howard Hughes' grandmother, Summerlin. That was her maiden name. So that is why it is now called Summerlin, because he is a very large landholder in the city of Las Vegas. And really, that really started to mark the end of the mob in Las Vegas, because that's when we started the corporations moving into the city and taking over a lot of these mob-run properties. That's when you get to the end of the movie Casino, where they say, how do they build these casinos? And they say junk bonds. And essentially, that's because we had these corporate companies that used these, this money that they would gain from things like junk bonds and stocks and that kind of thing, to front these very large hotels, which essentially you didn't see very many new hotels built until about the mid-90s. So really you had this sort of dead time between like the 1960s up until about the 1990s, but kind of going backwards back into the 70s, you did have Frank Lefty Rosenthal, which this is really sort of like the dirty version of the mob in Las Vegas. I would say the golden era of the mob in Las Vegas was really from about the mid 1940s to about the mid to late 60s, till when Howard Hughes got here. So this sort of in between time would be known as sort of like when the movie Casino took place, because that's when you had people like Frank Lefty Rosenthal, who had connections to the mob, wasn't a mobster himself, but he was somebody who had close ties to the mafia, which actually gave him the opportunity to run hotels in Las Vegas. He did run more than just one hotel. He ended up running places like the Stardust, the Fremont Hotel. He also ran, I believe, the Four Queens and the Fitzgerald, I believe. So many hotels on Fremont Street, as well as the Plaza, as well as the Strip. But the Strip, really, the main one was the Stardust Hotel, which was, I've heard, quite nice on the inside. The Frontier Hotel, same thing. They had the Frontier, the New Frontier. The El Rancho ended up going away at that point. But fun story about the El Rancho, which opened in 1941. The El Rancho, they say burned down in very mysterious circumstances. If you've seen the movie Goodfellas, there was a scene where they burned down a bar. They say that might have been behind the burning or fire at the El Rancho, excuse me. El Cortez, owned by Jackie Gahn, by the way. Brendan Gahn now owns South Point, which is... they're not connected. Just wanted to say that. Anyways, moving on. So getting into about the 70s, that's when you started getting Nick the Ant Sportolo. Nick the Ant was the Joe Pesci character in the movie Casino, which, yes, he was a very, very vicious guy. Yes, he was short, hence the ant because he was short, but very, very... what's what I'm looking for? Aggressive gentleman, which, yes, he was found in an Iowa cornfield. And yes, he was that mean. But if you actually go back and watch the movie Casino, there is a scene where they're walking across the street from the courthouse, and his lawyer, walking right next to him in that movie, in the film, is none other than Oscar Goodman. Oscar Goodman, a very well-known figure in the history of Las Vegas, was the, of course, lawyer for Nicky the Ant Sportolo and many other associates, and our two-term, maybe three-term mayor of the city of Las Vegas in the 90s. And I believe that he had a thing where he would tell people that, how could you be a lawyer for the mob and mafia who did these terrible things? And he says, well, someone's got to be their lawyer. Might as well be me. So, with that being said, he was known as the happiest mayor in all of Las Vegas. He would actually go a lot of places, and to this day, whenever he takes or is out in public, will always have a Bombay Sapphire Martini and 2 showgirls on each arm, because he's Mr. Las Vegas. So he was the mayor for a long time, and then his wife, Carolyn Goodman, ended up becoming mayor for a term limit, I believe, of 3 terms as well. But that takes us to about the 70s, into about the 80s, and essentially Vegas went into sort of a empty building time between the end of the 70s into the late to early 90s, which that's when you start getting people like Steve Wynn moving into Las Vegas and building hotels. Caesar's Palace, by the way, which I could have skipped over this, was owned by Jay Sarno for the longest time, and he was not connected to the mob, which is very interesting because Caesar's Palace is such an old property. But hey, sometimes you just skirt sort of the laws a little bit, and there you are. But with that being said, we move into the 90s. We really don't have a lot of mafia sort of influence in the city of Las Vegas anymore. Many people say that's sort of when the Russian mob moved in, and then they own a lot of places, a lot of strip clubs and stuff in town. But you don't really see it much in the city of Las Vegas, at least on the surface. I have been told that they may own the Brady, the Brady Linen Services, which service every single property on the Las Vegas Strip, which that's one way of staying connected. But at this point, I wouldn't say a lot of the mob is really connected to the city of Las Vegas anymore. A really great place to learn a lot of this history about the mafia and the city of Las Vegas is if you end up going to the Mob Museum itself. It's very interesting because you'll learn sort of like the basis of where the mob got started and why they came to America and in New York, and then migrated to Chicago and Los Angeles, and then ended up, in Las Vegas when you get to the second floor of the mob museum. And on the bottom floor, it hides the law enforcement and all the people that tried to stop the mob. I really skipped a lot of the stuff from Fremont Street. But Fremont Street, you have people like Benny Binion who were connected. Benny Binion himself ended up going to jail for tax evasion, which I think Benny Binion actually might have murdered somebody, but he went for tax evasion because that's what you do. And that's always a fun story because when Benny Binion left to go to prison, is that he gave his shares to a friend to hold until he got out of prison. And then that friend continued to stay on the board, but paid a fee to Benny Binion as a consultant for the Binion's Hotel and Casino. Very interesting stuff. But anyways, I think another day that I'll really dive into Steve Wynn. I've really wanted to talk about him. I'm essentially going to have to do like a whole preamble in the beginning of that episode saying that, yes, we know that Steve Wynn has been accused of like sexual harassment, but he was cleared of those charges because a couple different things, a couple accusations, but never went to fruition. But we can't really talk about the history of modern Las Vegas without talking about people like Steve Wynn and Kirk Kerkorian, people, Jay Serrano, people like this that really sort of shaped the city of Las Vegas, and Howard Hughes, of course. But anyways, I think I covered a lot of the mob. One of my favorite books about the city of Las Vegas and the mob is a book called When the Mob Ran Vegas. They have beautiful anecdotes on the inside. You don't have to read it sort of as like a novel. You can kind of jump around, but I think it's quite an interesting thing to sort of pick out in the book. One of my favorite people that I didn't talk about was Virginia Hill. Virginia Hill was the girlfriend of Mr. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. A really nice little myth that we used to like to sort of tell people, and people still say the story, is that the way that the flamingo came to be was that he was looking at his beautiful girlfriend who had very long legs like a flamingo and said, "You are my fabulous flamingo." And that's what was the name of the hotel when it opened. I don't think that's completely the answer of how the flamingo got its name, but it's one of our favorite anecdotes to tell people. And hey, why get in the way of a really good story? But anyways, that was the How or When the Mob Ran Las Vegas episode. Hopefully you enjoyed a little bit of the history of the city of Las Vegas and how it got to this point. I would recommend, if you do really enjoy the history of Las Vegas, in terms of the mob and the mafia and how it sort of ran casinos, check out the movie Casino, just because it does have a good bits of nuggets of how they used to run the hotels, which they actually show inside of the Mob Museum. So it must be pretty close. But anyways, thank you so much for listening, everybody. Thanks so much for listening, everybody. Hopefully you guys enjoy your weekend. Make sure to check out our Instagram page, ConsciousConfidential_LV. And you can also follow me, Brian_Ortega26, which is my personal Instagram. So thank you so much, everybody, for listening. I'll see you out in town. If you come up, say hello. But remember, keep it confidential.